Hi, all right, so first job for today, I don't know, this may take all of this session, may take a little less, is to get clear on some absolutely crucial concepts that we're going to be using throughout the course. They're concepts that you would need in any philosophy course. Okay? They're the concepts that we use in evaluating reasons to believe stuff, right? They are the concepts of an argument and the two key concepts used in evaluation, namely those of validity and soundness. Begin with the notion of an argument. The term argument in philosophy is a technical term in this sense. It means something different in philosophy than it typically does in ordinary everyday English. In ordinary everyday English, when we talk about an argument, we typically have in mind we typically have in mind a dispute, two sides, rancor, heat, that sort of thing. Yeah. By contrast, when we talk about an argument in philosophy, we're thinking purely about reasons to believe stuff, right? And Rachel's gives us a quite nice definition of the term in its philosophical sense, right? So, in the philosophical sense, as he has it, an argument is a chain of reasoning designed to prove something. Maybe we'll go to the first PowerPoint at this point. It's got that definition on it. Right? Can we go to the first PowerPoint? Some measure of technical difficulties here, everybody, but it's going to work real soon. There we go. Splendid for us. So just the first bit of it is what you want to write down for now. Of course, we'll get right on to the next thing. Ooh. I'm just looking at that. Just a minute. I don't know if there's anything I can do with this on the screen, but okay, so there's a bit missing on this here PowerPoint. Yeah. So it's a chain of reasoning designed to prove something. And a bit of the PowerPoint has disappeared. Oh, how lovely. Thank you. There's really a lot better. Cool. Excellent. So you've just got a missing D there, but it's much clearer. Good. All right, so everyone's got that down, right? Okay, so in thinking about arguments then, it's helpful to begin just with a simple, boring, familiar example. Like the example that we add up there. We'll get it back up in a sec. Because, I mean, yeah, there we go. So this is like the most famous example of an argument there is, right? So all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay. A word about terminology in that connection, just make sure everyone's clear, all right? So the statements that come before the therefore, right? In this case, 1, all men are mortal, 2, Socrates is a man, those are the premises, right? What comes after the therefore, in this case 3, Socrates is mortal, that's the conclusion. Okay, this example exhibits one of our key argument properties. This is a valid argument. There are a number of ways to express the concept of validity here, and let me do some of them for you, right? This is an argument such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Alternately put, this is an argument where it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Alternately put again, this is an argument where the conclusion follows from the premises. Here's another one as well. This is an argument where the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Okay? All right, if we could go back to the other chart, great. So now, so that's validity, right? And let me give you a definition. Good. Now, I should say definition here, I have two alternate versions. They're both standard definitions. I give the first one first because it's easier to process. The second one's harder because of the two ifs, and you need both. The other thing about this, I have deductively in brackets, because strictly speaking, that's what you should say. Strictly speaking, the term is deductively valid. But very often, we abbreviate, right? We don't say deductively valid, we just say valid. Everyone got that down? All right, so if we can go back to the other shot now, great. Let me now ask you a question. Right? Question is this. Suppose I give you a deductively valid argument for some conclusion. Have I thereby given you good reason to believe the conclusion? Okay, let me do a bit of a poll, actually. Okay, so the question is, if I give you a deductively valid argument for some conclusion, have I thereby given you good reason to believe it? How many people think I have? How many people think I haven't? Aha, well, good. So the majority is correct. Okay, so it is not the case that if I can give you a deductively valid argument for some conclusion, I've thereby given you good reason to believe it. Right? Because look. Consider, well, never mind, don't consider that one. Let's just go off the PowerPoint then. Could we nip off the PowerPoint? Cool. Yeah, we'll use it in a sec. But consider a modified version, right, of the argument we had. So we'll go to the PowerPoint. We'll use this. Okay. So look, this argument, this modified argument, is just as valid as the previous one was, right? You see that? It has just as much as the previous one did the property that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, right? that it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. But by presenting you with this, I have not given you good reason to believe that Socrates is mortal. Right? Is everyone with me here? Right? So, look, I mean, the thought is that, you know, the chipmunk argument I just gave you, right? It's just as valid as the previous one was, right? It has in just the same way, right? It has the property that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be, right? But by giving you that, I haven't given you good reason to believe that Socrates is mortal at all, right? Yeah? So, a deductively valid argument in and of itself doesn't give you good reason to believe the conclusion. So what more do we need? It's not enough just to give a valid argument. In order for an argument to give us good reason to believe the conclusion, what sort of argument do we need, or what do we need in addition? Yeah, a sound argument. We need a sound argument. What's a sound argument? Quite right. You say it has to be a valid argument and the premises must be true. And if you've got... let me go back just a minute. Don't go to PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. So the thing that does give us good reason to believe the conclusion, right, is, as you correctly say, soundness. Yeah? If I can supply you with a sound argument for some conclusion, I have given you good reason to believe it. We're missing a tiny bit of the PowerPoint again. It should be deductively with a closed bracket on the other side. All right, switch back. Yeah. It's important to be aware of two standard kinds of unsound argument. Right? One, we already saw, the chipmunk one. Right? That's an argument that's valid, but it's unsound, even though it has a true conclusion. Right? Another kind of argument it's helpful to have in mind, right, is an argument all of whose premises are true and whose conclusion is true, but which nonetheless is neither valid nor sound. Right? So let me find the right PowerPoint here. I've got one of these hiding here somewhere. Yeah, okay, cool. Have we got any way to make the PowerPoints that show up here look the same way they do on the laptop screen? Cool, thank you. Good. So you can see the recipe here, right? The recipe is, you know, just put together 3 randomly selected, unconnected true statements, All right, if we could switch back. So, there are two questions that we always want to ask about an argument once we've got it formulated. Now, let me tell you what I mean by formulate and formulation here. Right? When I talk about a formulation of an argument or formulating it, what I mean is having an explicit statement of the premises and the conclusion, right? Being able to write it out the way we've been writing these arguments out that we've just been looking at. If you got one of those, you formulated the argument, you got a formulation of it. Right? So, if you got a formulation of an argument, there are two questions that you always want to ask about it. And they're questions that you can kind of read off from the definition of soundness, right? One question is the argument valid? Right? The other question is, are the premises true? And those are very different questions, really. Right? One way to bring that out is to say that validity is an internal matter, whereas truth of premises is an external matter. That is, validity is internal in that it's a matter of the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, right? It's a matter of whether the premises lead to the conclusion follows from the premises. People sometimes say, this isn't strictly speaking right, but it's a useful metaphor, of whether the conclusion flows from the premises. Right? It's all a matter of the connections between these different statements or propositions. By contrast, truth of premises, that's an external matter, right? That's a matter not of the connections between the different statements that make the argument up, but rather of whether the premises accurately describe the external world as it is, right? So those are two very different matters, right? And you put them together in this definition of soundness, and you need both to have an argument that gives you good reason to believe the conclusion. Now, it is possible to study validity in a quite formal, technical way. Right? What you can do is you can translate arguments written in ordinary natural languages like English or Spanish or German or French or whatever into mathematical symbols, and then you can use various mathematical techniques to assess whether the arguments so translated are valid or not. The discipline in which you do that is called logic. Logic courses are, here and elsewhere, a fairly humane way to satisfy university math requirements. You will, however, be pleased to be reminded that this is not a logic course. Most of you, anyway. By and large, we won't be doing any of that. I mean, we will occasionally take just tiny little baby steps in the direction of logic. But I don't think we'll ever really get to using the techniques for validity assessment. Right? Instead, what we're going to rely on is your being, with a little training and a little practice, pretty good validity detectors, at least with respect to short arguments. Right? It's not that you're infallible. Right? I mean, there are arguments that tend to fool people. Those have a name, actually. They're called fallacies. Right? A fallacy is precisely an argument that looks valid but isn't. Yeah? But, you know, with a little practice, a little care, you'll be a pretty good validity detector. Right? And there's one worthwhile heuristic to have in mind, worthwhile sort of rule of thumb here, right? That is, once you've looked carefully at an argument, right? It's a pretty good rule of thumb to say if it doesn't look valid, it isn't, right? Because validity, once you've looked at it, should sort of leap out at you the way it does with that classic example of all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? Sort of unless you can see that the argument has that property, it probably doesn't. All right, now, I can't emphasize enough how crucial these concepts are, right? We're going to be using them throughout the semester, going to be a big part of the midterm, right? I mean, just consistently, this is vocabulary, these are concepts that we're going to be recurring to as our focus moves from over different areas and theories in ethics, right? So it's really crucial that you get them. It's not absolutely crucial that you get a complete grasp of them today, but it is crucial that you get a complete grasp of them before too long, right? With that in mind, let me see if anyone has any questions at this point, because I mean, if there's something that's not sticking here, if you're not clear on something, this would be a real good time to try and bring out any possible sources of confusion or unclarity and attempt to address. So does anyone have any questions about this? Yes.
Yeah, I got a question on the validity and the soundness. Soundness, it sounds a little redundant of the validity, in validity it says that if an argument is deductively valid, or that an argument is deductively valid if all the premises are true and the conclusion must be true. And then soundness, it sounds redundant when it says that it has to be deductively valid and that all its premises are true.
Good, okay, so that's one standard thing that's really worth getting clear about, okay? So look, I mean, you suggest it's redundant because you read the second alternate definition of validity as making validity conditional on the premises being true. But it's not. That's the two ifs thing, right? The second alternate definition of validity does not say an argument is valid if all the premises are true. Instead, it says an argument is valid if all the premises are true, the conclusion has to be, right? That is not, I mean, it's not the same. It's as the chipmunk example, among others, makes clear, right? An argument can be valid though all its premises are false, right? Validity is not at all a matter of whether the premises are in fact true. It is instead a matter of it's being the case that if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be. Okay? And as I said, the reason why I put the second definition of validity second is, although it's standard, it does have that potentially problematic feature that you've got to properly read the double if. Good. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a very standard thing that tends to trick people. Yes. And anything else? All right. Good. So what we'll do now then is in the way that Rachel's does, we'll now start to apply these concepts in thinking about our first sort of issue in ethics, this issue of what we'll broadly label moral relativism. Right? So, let me see, I think I've got one of those. I skipped forward, but I've got one of those agenda slides here. So this is just it's just to give you a sense of where we're going on this topic, right? And you probably don't really need to write this down. The thing that is worth noting about it, I guess, is we're going to start really just tracking what's in the Rachels. That's the two arguments for moral skepticism. But then the latter bits, the distinction between different broadly relativist views and the third kind of argument for broadly relativist views, there we'll introduce something different that's not as explicit in the Rachels. All right, so if we can go back to, yeah, great. All right, so in our introductory discussion last time, right, various of you in, interestingly, different guises raised versions of the idea that morality is all relative, it's all just a matter of opinion, you can't know anything about it, right? And what we want to do now is precisely to think about the merits of those kind of views. The agenda, I mean, I should use a different word. The aim here, which I share with Rachel's, is not to show that nothing in this ballpark is correct, to sort of demonstrate that it's all false, right? It's rather more modestly to demonstrate that it's not obviously true, right? To demonstrate, that is, that standard, simple, familiar arguments for views of this kind don't work. Right? Now, there are, and we'll bring this home in a little while, there are importantly different views of this broad kind, right? And it's important to make those distinctions. It's important to be clear about just what view you are considering at each point when you're thinking about it. That's true in philosophy in general, and it's true in this bit of it in particular, right? So it's useful to begin. Oh, yeah, hold on. I was going to move there. Yeah. All right. So it's useful to begin with a clear formulation of one view in this ballpark, the one that Rachel's focuses on, the one he calls moral skepticism. And here's the definition. So then, as he defines it, right, so the moral skepticism is the view that there's no such thing as objective moral truth. The one sort of concept employed in that definition, which it may be worth explaining a little more, is the concept of objective truth. Right? Here's two ways to go, giving such an explanation. Right? The first way to go is just by appeal to examples of matters about which we all think there is an objective truth. Right? We all think there's an objective truth about sort of how tall this room is, right? How far it is from floor to ceiling. I mean, if you're being careful and given that this is Houston and, you know, stuff tends to move around a bit. It's probably different slightly in different places, but still there's a truth about the height at any given point in the room. Right? We think there's an objective truth about, you know, the size of the earth, the chemical composition of water, etc., etc. So look, the moral skeptic is the person who denies that there's truth of that sort in ethics, in morality. The further thing you can do trying to explicate this concept is to try and sort of state abstractly what objective truth amounts to, right? And the standard way to do that is to talk about objective truth as being truth that's mind independent, or that doesn't depend on what we happen to think about it. Right? That's the feature that, you know, we all take, you know, the height of this room and so forth to have, right? And that's the feature that the moral skeptic denies that moral truth has. All right. So, having given us the definition, right, Rachel's properly says, well, look, it means one thing to define a view, but then you've got to decide whether you've got reason to believe it, right? That is, you've got to decide what argument you can give in its favor. And I think he does a pretty good job. I mean, you know, there's one standard argument I think he misses. That's what I'm going to do a bit later on. But I think he does a pretty good job of identifying the most familiar reasons that people have, that people tend to find persuasive, in favor of moral skepticism. So the first kind of argument he considers is an argument premised on moral disagreement, right? So the thought is that there's disagreement between individuals, between societies, about moral matters, and that shows that moral skepticism is true, that there's no such thing as objective moral truth. Right? He focuses in developing this argument on a particular example, right? The example of differences between what we think and what the Eskimos think about the morality of infanticide, right? And he calls the argument so focused the cultural differences argument. Let me see. Here we go. So here it is. Again, we're missing a little bit. Is there any way to shrink it? Yeah. Well, I guess we'll shift it back. We obviously have a technical issue that we will attempt to sort out in the break here, because I mean, what shows up fully on the laptop screen doesn't show up fully on the monitor. Why? Oh, but it's okay. All right. But it's okay for you guys. Huh? Well, so maybe it's just me. Well, that's all right. Don't mind that. Okay. Good. Do you recommend, for those of you in the studio, writing this down? This is what, you know, I would normally write on the blackboard, and this is your notes as I see it.
In the book, so it's okay to just write it down. Do we have to?
Well, I'm not going to make you. I just, you know, I mean, I normally write things on the board because I think it's a good learning thing for you to write it down, right? But any of my ideas about learning, you're free to try other ones out, see if they work for you. All right. So, do you remember then? So what are the two questions that we can read off the definition of soundness that we always have to ask about an argument once we have it formulated? Remember? Yeah, but what, is it valid? Are the premises true? Good. Yeah. All right. So, start with the first question, the question of validity. Let's do a little poll here. See how we're doing. If we could do it, we do the classroom shot. Yeah. Okay. So, how many people think the cultural differences argument is valid? Raise your hand if you think it's valid. Really raise your hand if you think it's valid. Okay. There's half raised hands there. Go on, really raise them. You know, like that, if you think it's valid. Right? Okay. Raise your hand if you think it's not valid. Okay, yeah, so the majority is right on this occasion. And that's good. We could switch back here. Now, this tends to be actually one of the things that people have experience suggests the hardest time sort of securely getting, right, that the cultural differences argument is not valid. And obviously, you know, a bunch of us here are on the right track, and that's good. Let's do the explanation. First off, we'll do it sort of abstractly, right? I mean, why isn't this argument valid? Look, here's the deal, right? The form of the cultural differences argument is this, you know? Some people believe A, some people believe not A. Therefore, there's no objective fact about whether A or not A. And that doesn't follow, right? I mean, it doesn't follow from the fact that people disagree about something that there's no truth. Yeah? See that? I mean, that's just what the cultural differences argument trades on, right? I mean, that's just the sort of structure of that argument. Yeah? So that's the invalidity point sort of put abstractly, right? The other way to approach this, and Rachel's does this explicitly, and this can be a useful technique sometimes, right? The other way to approach it is to try to get a grip on the question by looking at an argument with just the same structure, but about a different subject matter, right? And the deal is, if the two arguments have the same structure, then, you know, if one of them's valid, the other one is, and if one of them's invalid, the other one is too. Right? So he has it roughly this form in this edition of the book. Here's an argument that has just the same structure as the cultural differences argument does. Right? You've made substitutions here, right? Just makes it easier to assume that the Eskimos are flat earthers. I have no reason to believe that's true, but, you know, it just makes the example work more cleanly. Right? Everyone got that? Flip back in a bit. Thanks. So the point here, right, is this argument has exactly the same structure that the original one does, right? I mean, in both cases, it's an argument where the premises concern a disagreement and the conclusion is drawn that there's no fact of the matter, right? But, I mean, it's supposed to be helpful because basically no one, or pretty much no one, has a tendency to think that the parallel argument's a valid argument, right? But then, you know, if you persuade yourself of that, and then you notice that the arguments share the same structure, that's supposed to help you see, right, that the original cultural differences argument with respect to moral differences is equally invalid. All right. Again, this is one of those things that tends to trip people up. So I want to make very sure, at least, you know, that everyone here in the studio has this point sort of securely grasped, right? I mean, I don't want it to be that you go away and in, you know, 2 or 3 days' time, if presented with the cultural differences argument, you would reflexively answer the question, is this valid, with yes, right? So if there's anyone who is in any way sort of not seeing that the cultural differences argument is invalid, if anyone's in the position where, you know, of course, you know, I'm saying it's not and Rachel's is saying it's not, so they know that that's the answer you're supposed to say, but they don't really see why, this would be a really good point to ask a question. Go ahead.
I just don't understand. Like they use that argument about the world being round and flat.
You say they use the argument about the world being round and flat. Yeah. Cool. Thank you, sir.
They use the argument about being round, the Earth being round and flat. But
yeah.
If I were to use an argument, say in some cultures homosexuality is accepted, in other cultures sexuality is not accepted, then wouldn't the first argument be the first conclusion would be right?
Okay, good. I think what that illustrates, right? I mean, I actually think what you're raising there is the thing that's most likely to trip people up here, right? What you suggest is, you know, in effect, if the argument was, you know, in some societies, infanticide is accepted, in other societies, it's not accepted. You know, therefore, it's neither objectively right nor objectively wrong. I think the idea that's in play is the idea that objectively right must just mean accepted, right? So the key thing to understand about the way the concept is being used, right, certainly in the formulation of this argument, but, you know, systematically by Rachel's, right, is, you know, right does not just mean accepted, right? To say of something that is right is to say that it has the property of being genuinely morally correct, right? Now, of course, the moral skeptic is the person who wants to argue that there's no such property, right? But it won't do to argue for that sort of based on a definition of that property that the other side doesn't believe, right? So look, the person who believes that there's such a thing as objective rightness, and actually, well, I'll bracket that. The person who believes there's such a thing as objective rightness precisely doesn't think for something to be objectively right just is for a certain society to accept it, right? There is an inferential gap from what people accept to whether it's right. And I do think the thing that's most likely to trip a person up about this argument is implicitly accepting a sort of working definition of right, where objectively right just means, you know, accepted by a certain society, right? But, you know, as it were, the key thing to seeing what's going on in this argument is to see that's not what objectively right is being taken to mean here, right? The key idea is there's a gap between what people believe and what is right. Okay? Does that help? Okay. Anyone else? Because there are various ways in which this comes up. Yeah, go ahead.
So, like, in simpler terms, could you just say if, like, an argument is almost opinionated, that it probably isn't going to be valid? Because I could think something different than you can, so you can't sit there and say, well, I'm right and you're wrong, right? So if it's an argumented or opinionated argument, it pretty much won't be valid, right? Is that what pretty much you're saying, like, in simpler terms?
No, I would say so. So I mean, you know, so that's.
Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I think I do. Look, so the way you put it is, if it's an opinionated argument, it's not going to be valid. I mean, look, here's why I don't want to put it like that, okay? So there are some conclusions that would follow from premises about opinions, right? Namely, conclusions about opinions, right? So I take it the following argument is valid, right? You know, the Eskimos think infanticide is morally acceptable. We think infanticide is morally unacceptable. Therefore, there is disagreement about the morality of infanticide. Right? I mean, that's a valid argument. Right? So, it's not. I mean, I wouldn't put the moral as, you know, there are no valid arguments whatsoever involving opinions. Right? Rather, you know, the moral here is you can't go from premises to the effect that people disagree about something to the conclusion that there's no truth to the matter, right? I mean, I see the temptation to do it, to say it the way you're going to say it, but I do think, you know, if you generalize it and then start to think about other examples like the one I give you, you'll see that there is no general rule to the effect that there's never a valid argument, you know, premised on opinions or differences of opinion, right? I mean, you could have a valid one as long as the conclusion is of the right kind. But the point is, this sort of conclusion doesn't follow from these premises. Good. Yeah, question at the back. Yeah, I think you push it and like the green light comes on. Is it not coming on? Say it anyway, I'll repeat it.
Okay, so you're saying that both of these arguments are not valid?
So you ask, am I saying that both of these arguments are invalid, namely the original cultural differences argument and the parallel argument? Yes, I am. I'm saying of both of them that they are invalid. They are equally invalid and invalid for the same reason. Yes. Yes. Good. I appreciate those questions. Anything else? Yeah.
Sorry, I know you said it's off, but is the cultural difference argument invalid just because the conclusion is false, not like in life, but like according to the premises?
You say, is the cultural differences invalid because...
And then those are the first two premises, and the conclusion is no objective thought of A. So according to the premises, the conclusion is false?
So is it invalid because according to the premises the conclusion is false? No, that wouldn't be the way to put it, because look, for an argument to be invalid, it just has to be the case that it's not that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be, right? It's not that invalidity requires that the truth of the premises guarantees the falsity of the conclusion. It's enough that the truth of the premises doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Yeah? It's perfectly possible for all that Rachel says about the cultural differences argument that the conclusion be true, right? The point simply is, at this point, that these premises do not provide support for it. Okay? I mean, sort of general moral here. It's this stuff can get quite tricky, and you can think you've got it, right? And then, but when you sort of push a bit, you know, you can discover that there's more to be found. Yes.
Okay, for like the parallel argument, can you make it so that it is valid, so it just makes sense?
Well, I mean, again, I could make a different argument that was no longer parallel, which would be valid, right? And the way I would do that, again, would be to change the conclusion, right? So, you know, if I change the conclusion from the Earth is neither objectively flat nor objectively round to cultures disagree about the shape of the Earth, I'd then have a valid argument. But, you know, by the same token, it wouldn't be an argument that really was parallel to the original one, right? Good. Anything else on this? All right. I think, you know, we're done with this session. We'll take a little break and we'll come back.